Right now, at this exact moment, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders are claiming they've successfully struck a United States military installation in Iraq with what they're calling hypersonic missiles, weapons that, if the claims are accurate, travel at speeds exceeding Mach 5 and possess maneuvering capabilities that render traditional missile defense systems effectively useless. The United States Central Command hasn't confirmed the strike. Iran's state media is broadcasting footage of missile launches accompanied by claims of devastating precision hits against American forces. This represents either the first combat deployment of Iranian hypersonic weapons against American military assets or the most brazen propaganda fabrication Tehran has attempted in years. And the difference between those two possibilities determines whether we're witnessing a technological earthquake in Middle Eastern military balance or a desperate information warfare gambit from a regime under unprecedented pressure. Let me walk you through exactly what happened over the past 18 hours, because the timeline reveals critical details that mainstream coverage is completely missing. At approximately 0340 hours local time on Tuesday, March 10, 2026, commercial satellite operators detected unusual thermal signatures consistent with ballistic missile launches from a facility near Karamabad in western Iran, roughly 220 kilometers from the Iraqi border. The launch site corresponds to a known Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force installation that Western intelligence agencies have previously identified as housing advanced missile development and deployment infrastructure. Within 90 seconds of those initial launches, the Iranian Students' News Agency, which maintains close operational ties to the IRGC, published a statement claiming that hypersonic missiles had been fired at American occupation forces in Iraq. The statement specifically referenced Al-Assad Air Base in Anbar province, the same installation that Iran struck with conventional ballistic missiles in January 2020 following the American assassination of Qasem Soleimani. That 2020 strike injured more than 100 American service members with traumatic brain injuries despite causing no immediate fatalities, and it represented the first direct Iranian military attack on American forces in decades. By 0420 hours, Iranian state television was broadcasting what they claimed was live footage of missile impacts, showing nighttime infrared imagery of explosions against what appeared to be military infrastructure. The footage quality was poor enough to prevent independent verification of location or actual damage assessment. At 0445 hours, the semi-official Fars news agency, which functions essentially as an IRGC media outlet, published claims that 4 missiles had successfully struck command and control facilities at Al-Assad, with additional claims of significant American casualties. By 0530 hours, United States Central Command posted a brief statement on X, formerly Twitter, reading, "CENTCOM is aware of reports of missile activity in Iraq. We are assessing the situation and will provide updates as information becomes available." That carefully neutral language told you everything about American uncertainty in those initial hours. They weren't denying the strikes occurred. They weren't confirming Iranian claims. They were buying time to figure out what actually happened. At 0615 hours, Iraqi security sources speaking to Reuters reported hearing multiple explosions in the vicinity of Al-Assad Air Base, but could not confirm whether the base itself had been hit or whether explosions occurred in surrounding desert areas. This is critical because Al-Assad sprawls across approximately 60 square kilometers of Iraqi desert, and distinguishing between missiles hitting the base perimeter versus actual operational infrastructure requires detailed battle damage assessment that takes hours, not minutes. By 0800 hours, American military officials speaking on condition of anonymity told the Associated Press that some kind of missile attack had indeed occurred, but that initial assessments indicated minimal to no damage to critical infrastructure and no American casualties. But here's what makes this situation genuinely unprecedented. Those same officials could not definitively confirm or deny whether the missiles used possessed hypersonic capabilities, telling reporters that technical analysis of missile debris and trajectory data was ongoing. That brings us to the central technical question that determines whether this incident represents a genuine strategic shift or an overhyped propaganda exercise. Did Iran actually deploy hypersonic weapons? And if so, what capabilities do these systems possess? Let me explain why this matters more than you might initially understand. The term hypersonic missile gets thrown around constantly in defense media, but it actually encompasses two very different weapon categories with dramatically different strategic implications. The first category is hypersonic glide vehicles, or HGVs, which launch atop conventional ballistic missiles, separate during the mid-course phase of flight, and then glide toward their targets at hypersonic speeds, generally defined as Mach 5 or higher, while executing unpredictable maneuvers that complicate interception. China's DF-17 and Russia's Avangard systems fall into this category. The second category is hypersonic cruise missiles, which use scramjet propulsion to sustain hypersonic speeds throughout powered flight at relatively low altitudes. Russia's Kinzhal, despite being marketed as hypersonic, is actually just an air-launched variant of the Iskander ballistic missile that achieves high speeds through ballistic trajectory rather than sustained hypersonic cruise. Iran has been developing what it calls the Fateh hypersonic missile system since at least 2022, with the IRGC publicly unveiling what they claimed was a functional prototype in June 2023. According to Iranian state media descriptions at the time, the Fateh is a two-stage solid-fuel ballistic missile with a hypersonic glide vehicle that separates during terminal phase and maneuvers toward its target at speeds reportedly exceeding Mach 30. Iranian officials claimed the system could strike targets up to 1,400 kilometers away, with precision measured in meters rather than tens of meters, and that its maneuvering capabilities during the terminal phase made it effectively immune to interception by American Patriot systems, Israeli Arrow systems, or even the more advanced THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, batteries that the United States has deployed to the Middle East. Those are extraordinary claims, and Western defense analysts have been deeply skeptical about whether Iran actually possesses the technological sophistication to produce genuine hypersonic glide vehicles with the precision guidance systems and heat-resistant materials required for controlled hypersonic flight. The fundamental challenge with hypersonic weapons isn't just achieving high speeds. Ballistic missiles have traveled at hypersonic velocities during re-entry for decades. The challenge is maintaining controlled flight and precision guidance while traveling at speeds where atmospheric friction generates temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, where conventional control surfaces become ineffective, and where minute trajectory adjustments require extraordinarily sophisticated computational systems operating in milliseconds. The United States, despite possessing technological advantages in virtually every other military domain, has struggled to field operational hypersonic weapons, with multiple test failures and program delays plaguing American development efforts. China has demonstrated more success, conducting multiple tests of the DF-17 system and reportedly deploying operational units to frontline forces. Russia claims operational deployment of multiple hypersonic systems. The Western intelligence agencies remain uncertain about how many of these systems actually work as advertised versus serving primarily as propaganda and deterrence tools. So could Iran, a country operating under comprehensive international sanctions that severely restrict access to advanced materials and manufacturing equipment, have successfully developed hypersonic glide vehicles that the United States itself has struggled to perfect? The honest answer is that it's theoretically possible, but highly unlikely without significant external assistance. Multiple intelligence assessments over the past 3 years have suggested that Iran's missile development programs receive substantial technical support from both China and North Korea, with some reports indicating that Iranian engineers have had direct access to Chinese hypersonic research data and potentially even Chinese manufactured components that Iran cannot produce domestically. North Korea's successful development of the Hwasong-8, which Pyongyang claims is a hypersonic glide vehicle system, suggests that hypersonic technology is proliferating beyond the traditional great power competition between the United States, China, and Russia. If North Korea can develop functional hypersonic systems, there's no technical reason Iran couldn't achieve similar capabilities with Chinese assistance. But here's where things get really interesting from a strategic analysis perspective. Iran doesn't actually need genuine hypersonic capabilities for this strike to achieve its primary objectives. Let me explain the strategic logic that makes this attack make sense regardless of whether the hypersonic claims prove accurate. Iran finds itself in an extraordinarily precarious position in March 2026. The regime is facing its most serious domestic legitimacy crisis in decades, with ongoing protests that have evolved from initial women's rights demonstrations into broader challenges to clerical rule itself. The Iranian economy continues to contract under the weight of American sanctions, with inflation exceeding 40% and the rial having lost more than 60% of its value against the dollar since 2021. Regional rivals, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, have been normalizing relations with Israel and strengthening security cooperation with the United States, creating an emerging anti-Iranian coalition that threatens Tehran's regional influence. And perhaps most critically, Iran's primary deterrent asset, its nuclear program, faces increasing pressure, with Israeli intelligence operations having successfully assassinated multiple senior nuclear scientists and sabotaged key nuclear facilities over the past several years. In this context, demonstrating advanced military capabilities serves multiple strategic purposes even if those capabilities are partially exaggerated. First, it signals to the United States that military strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities or other strategic targets would encounter sophisticated defenses and invite precise retaliation against American forces throughout the region. The message isn't, "We definitely have hypersonic missiles that can definitely penetrate all your defenses." The message is, "Are you absolutely certain we don't? And are you willing to bet American lives on that certainty?" Second, it demonstrates to domestic audiences that the regime retains military strength and technological advancement despite sanctions and international isolation, countering narratives of weakness and decline that fuel internal opposition. Third, it complicates Israeli and American military planning by introducing uncertainty about Iranian capabilities, forcing both countries to allocate additional defensive resources and potentially deterring strikes they might otherwise consider acceptable risks. Fourth, it sends signals to potential partners like China and Russia that Iran represents a valuable strategic asset worth supporting against American pressure, potentially encouraging deeper military and economic cooperation. According to Dr. Afshin Ostavar, Associate Professor of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School and author of Vanguard of the Imam, Religion, Politics, and Iran's Revolutionary Guards, Iran's missile strategy has always emphasized psychological and strategic impact over pure military effectiveness. In an analysis published by the Carnegie Endowment just 6 weeks ago, Ostavar wrote, "Iran's missile arsenal serves primarily as a deterrent and signaling tool rather than a war-fighting capability designed to defeat American or Israeli militaries in conventional conflict. The IRGC understands that it cannot match American military power missile for missile or bomb for bomb. Instead, Iranian missile doctrine focuses on imposing costs, demonstrating resolve, and maintaining ambiguity about true capabilities to complicate adversary decision-making. That framework helps explain why Iran might conduct a strike like this even with missiles that might not actually possess genuine hypersonic characteristics. The strategic communication matters more than the technical specifications. But let's also consider what this looks like from the American perspective, because the United States faces genuinely difficult choices in how to respond to this incident. If the missiles that struck al-Assad were indeed hypersonic systems, that represents a fundamental shift in Middle Eastern military balance that cannot go unanswered. Hypersonic weapons specifically threaten the American military advantage that has underpinned regional security architecture since Desert Storm in 1991, the ability to project overwhelming air power while keeping major assets like aircraft carriers and air bases largely immune to enemy attack. American carrier strike groups and regional air bases have operated for 3 decades with confidence that adversary missiles either couldn't reach them or could be intercepted by layered defensive systems. Hypersonic weapons, with their combination of speed, maneuverability, and low-altitude approach profiles, potentially break that defensive paradigm. If Iran can credibly threaten American carriers in the Persian Gulf or bases in Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain with missiles that cannot be reliably intercepted, the entire American regional presence becomes vastly more vulnerable and potentially untenable during conflict. That means the United States cannot simply dismiss Iranian hypersonic claims as propaganda without careful verification, because dismissing a genuine capability shift would represent catastrophic strategic blindness. but responding as if the claims are accurate when they might be exaggerated risks validating Iranian propaganda and potentially escalating toward military confrontation over capabilities that don't actually exist. The Washington Post reported this morning, citing 3 American defense officials speaking anonymously, that the Pentagon has dispatched specialized technical intelligence teams to Iraq to examine missile debris and conduct forensic analysis of the strike. Those teams will be looking for specific indicators: heat-resistant materials consistent with hypersonic flight, guidance system components that would enable terminal maneuvering, propulsion system remnants that would indicate whether these were genuine hypersonic glide vehicles or simply ballistic missiles following predictable trajectories. That analysis will take days, potentially weeks, to produce definitive conclusions. In the meantime, both countries are operating in a fog of uncertainty that creates significant risk of miscalculation. Consider also the timing of this strike, because it didn't occur in a strategic vacuum. Just 72 hours ago, on Saturday, March 7th, American and Iranian officials held indirect talks in Oman focused on potential frameworks for reviving some form of nuclear agreement or at least establishing guardrails to prevent further escalation. Those talks, according to reporting from Bloomberg and Reuters, made essentially zero progress, with both sides maintaining maximalist positions that left no room for compromise. The United States continues to demand full Iranian compliance with nuclear enrichment limitations, complete transparency for international inspectors, and binding constraints on Iran's ballistic missile program. Iran continues to demand complete sanctions relief, compensation for economic damage suffered under sanctions, and guarantees that future American administrations cannot simply withdraw from any agreement as President Trump did in 2018. The talks reportedly ended with both sides agreeing only to continue exploring possibilities for dialogue, diplomatic language that translates to "we accomplished nothing but don't want to publicly admit complete failure." Less than 3 days after those talks collapsed, Iran launches what it claims are hypersonic missiles at American forces. That's not coincidence. That's strategic signaling. Iran is demonstrating that diplomatic engagement doesn't equal military restraint, and that Tehran retains the capability and willingness to escalate militarily while talking diplomatically. This represents classic deterrence theory in action. Iran is trying to establish that it negotiates from strength, not weakness, and that the United States cannot simply wait for sanctions and pressure to force Iranian capitulation. From Tehran's perspective, showing military capability immediately after diplomatic failure makes strategic sense because it demonstrates that Iran has alternatives to negotiated settlement, and that continued American pressure will face increasingly dangerous Iranian responses. But here's what makes this moment genuinely dangerous rather than just another round of Middle Eastern saber-rattling. The escalatory dynamics have changed fundamentally since the last major American-Iranian crisis in January 2020. Back then, the Soleimani assassination and subsequent Iranian ballistic missile strike on al-Assad occurred within a relatively stable regional framework. Saudi Arabia and Iran, while adversaries, maintained indirect communication channels. Turkey played a somewhat stabilizing role as a regional power, maintaining relationships with all parties. And critically, both the United States and Iran signaled clearly that neither wanted full-scale war, with President Trump notably choosing not to retaliate for the al-Assad strike, despite significant political pressure to do so. The crisis de-escalated within weeks, and while tensions remained high, both sides found off-ramps that prevented catastrophic escalation. Today's regional dynamics are far less stable. Saudi-Iranian relations, while showing some improvement through recent Chinese-brokered diplomatic engagement, remain fundamentally adversarial, with the Yemen conflict continuing to serve as a proxy battlefield. Turkish foreign policy has become more unpredictable and nationalist under President Erdogan, with Ankara pursuing its own interests often at odds with both American and Iranian preferences. Israel has moved significantly rightward politically, with a governing coalition that includes ministers openly advocating military strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities and showing little interest in American calls for restraint. And perhaps most critically, the political situation in Washington has shifted dramatically. The current American administration faces significant domestic political pressure to demonstrate strength against Iran, with congressional Republicans, and some Democrats alike demanding robust responses to any Iranian provocation. The political space for the kind of restraint President Trump showed in 2020, choosing not to escalate after the al-Assad strike, may simply not exist in 2026. Dr. Kareem Sajidpour, senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and one of America's most respected Iran analysts, wrote in a Foreign Affairs essay last month. The tragedy of American-Iranian relations is that both countries are now led by domestic political coalitions that benefit from confrontation rather than conciliation. In Tehran, the Revolutionary Guards have consolidated power and depend on external threats to justify internal repression and economic control. In Washington, both political parties compete to demonstrate hawkishness on Iran, with neither wanting to be seen as weak or naive. This creates a dynamic where escalation serves both sides' domestic political interests, even as it damages both countries' strategic positions. That's the dangerous context in which this hypersonic missile incident is unfolding. Both countries have domestic political incentives to escalate rather than de-escalate, even though both countries would ultimately suffer from full-scale military conflict. Let me explain what American military retaliation options look like, because understanding the range of potential responses helps us assess which scenarios are most likely. At the minimal end of the escalation spectrum, the United States could respond with enhanced air defense deployments to regional bases, moving additional Patriot and THAAD batteries into Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar to demonstrate defensive capability without conducting offensive strikes. This would be paired with public statements condemning the attack and threatening consequences for future Iranian actions. This minimal response would satisfy neither hawks demanding retaliation nor allies expecting American protection, but it would avoid immediate military escalation and preserve diplomatic options. The challenge with minimal response is that it risks encouraging further Iranian provocations by demonstrating that attacks on American forces carry no kinetic consequences. At the moderate escalation level, the United States could conduct limited precision strikes against the specific missile launch site near Karamabad that was used for this attack, destroying launch infrastructure while avoiding broader targeting of Iranian military capabilities or inflicting mass casualties. This would represent proportional retaliation that punishes the specific attack without triggering regional war. American planners could use standoff weapons, cruise missiles launched from ships in the Persian Gulf or air-launched weapons delivered by B-2 stealth bombers operating from outside Iranian air defense range, to minimize risk to American personnel while demonstrating strike capability. The challenge with this moderate option is that it assumes Iran would accept the retaliatory strike without further escalation, an assumption that may prove incorrect given Iranian domestic political pressures to demonstrate strength. At the maximum escalation level, the United States could conduct comprehensive strikes against Iran's entire ballistic missile infrastructure, targeting not just the specific launch site, but the factories, storage facilities, command centers, and testing ranges that comprise Iran's missile program. This would be paired with strikes on Iranian air defense systems to establish air superiority, potentially expanding to include strikes on nuclear facilities, IRGC headquarters, and critical infrastructure. This maximum option would aim to fundamentally degrade Iranian military capabilities and potentially trigger regime change through internal collapse. The obvious challenge is that such comprehensive strikes would require thousands of sorties, risk significant American casualties, trigger Iranian retaliation against Israel and Gulf allies, potentially close the Strait of Hormuz through which 21% of global oil flows, and likely spark broader regional war involving Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria, and potentially even direct involvement by Russia or China seeking to exploit American distraction. The most likely American response falls somewhere between minimal and moderate, enhanced defensive deployments paired with limited strikes on specific Iranian military targets directly connected to this attack. But here's what you need to understand about even limited American strikes. They would occur in a fundamentally different context than the last major American military action against Iranian forces. When American forces killed Qasem Soleimani in January 2020, Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was firmly in control of Iranian decision-making, able to calibrate Iranian responses according to strategic calculation rather than emotional reaction. Today, Khamenei is 84 years old, in reportedly declining health, and facing potential succession struggles within the Iranian leadership. The IRGC, which controls the missile forces that conducted this attack, has consolidated political power but faces internal factions with different strategic preferences. Some IRGC commanders favor continued confrontation with the United States as a way to maintain their domestic political relevance and economic control. Others recognize that war with the United States would likely destroy the IRGC's economic empire and potentially trigger regime collapse. This internal Iranian political uncertainty matters enormously for escalation dynamics because it means that even if Iran's current leadership wanted to de-escalate after American retaliation, they might not have the internal political authority to prevent hardline factions from conducting further attacks. Intelligence assessments reported by the Wall Street Journal last week suggested that Khamenei's declining health has created unofficial competition among potential successors, with different factions maneuvering for position by demonstrating nationalist credentials and military strength. In that context, backing down from confrontation with the United States could be seen as fatal political weakness, creating incentives for escalation even when strategic logic suggests restraint. Now let me walk you through 3 distinct scenarios for how this crisis evolves over the next week to 10 days, with probability assessments for each pathway based on current indicators and historical precedent. Scenario 1 is diplomatic de-escalation through back-channel engagement and mutual de-escalatory signaling. In this scenario, the United States and Iran use indirect channels, likely through Omani or Qatari intermediaries who maintain relationships with both countries, to establish red lines and create off-ramps from the current crisis. The United States makes clear that it will not tolerate further attacks on American forces, but signals that it does not seek regime change or comprehensive war. Iran makes clear that this attack was a one-time demonstration triggered by specific grievances rather than the beginning of sustained campaign against American forces. Both sides engage in public rhetoric that sounds tough, but includes subtle signals to the other side indicating willingness to de-escalate. The United States enhances air defenses and conducts shows of force, moving carrier strike groups, flying bomber missions, but does not actually strike Iranian territory. Iran ceases further attacks and moderates its public claims about the hypersonic strike, perhaps walking back some of the more inflammatory statements from state media. For this diplomatic de-escalation scenario to succeed, several conditions must hold. First, the battle damage assessment must confirm that no American service members were killed in the strike. It's vastly easier for both countries to de-escalate when there are no American casualties requiring political responses. Second, both countries need domestic political space for restraint. In the United States, that means congressional leaders and key political constituencies accepting that not every provocation requires kinetic response. In Iran, that means Khamenei and the IRGC leadership maintaining sufficient control to prevent rogue elements from conducting follow-on attacks. Third, regional actors, particularly Israel and Saudi Arabia, must not conduct their own military actions that complicate American-Iranian dynamics. If Israel uses this crisis as cover to strike Iranian nuclear facilities, or if Saudi forces escalate in Yemen, either action could derail de-escalation efforts. Fourth, the technical analysis of the missiles must yield results that both sides can live with, ideally showing that Iran conducted some kind of advanced missile attack that demonstrates capability, without fully confirming hypersonic claims that would require more robust American response.